Welcome to Liberty on the Rocks, Los Angeles. We're going to start. Let's hit the cursor. Let's do that.
Yeah. That way all the propaganda that is spewed will not.
Okay. So we are going to start.
Hey, so Noah.
Am I too live? Someone tell me. Is this okay? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? There we go. So I'm Pablo. I am one of the coordinators of Liberty on the Rocks, along with Melinda and Andrew and Nick and Noah and we are super excited to have you all here. I am going to introduce a speaker who I first came across in the spring of 2012 on the campus of UCLA when he had the distinct honor of introducing Ron Paul to 7,000 Angelinos, which to date remains the largest Liberty meetup, which we hope to one day beat. But Kotesky is a veteran of the Liberty movement. He's most recently an intern at the Reason Foundation, where he's been working on the Reason Group public opinion poll, which we'll be discussing today at length, as it relates to what is charmingly referred to in the mainstream media as the Liberty Kids. But this is a generation of millennials who are working on a very old project of human freedom, and it includes among their ranks individuals like Justin Amash, who's a champion of the Constitution in the House of Representatives, and innovators like the founder of Lyft, who is disrupting technology and transportation in the face of harsh regulations to the contrary. And Tyler, in the past few years, has been very active in the Liberty movement as the president of Young Americans for Liberty at the UCLA campus. And he founded the Youth for Ron Paul at UCLA during the 2012 election cycle, in which he was critical in collecting 1,500 petitions to bring Ron Paul to campus. And in a very frenetic week in the spring of 2012, made that happen along with the folks at Liberty HQ. He also introduced Ron Paul at this rally that was attended by 7,000 individuals, and I was there. If you were there as well, raise your hand. This was, to me, a milestone event in that it showed me that there are other liberty-minded individuals in LA, and it would be worthwhile to organize a meetup. He has also interned for Senator Rand Paul in the summer of 2013 in DC. And 2 years ago, he interned at the Institute for Humane Studies for learnliberty.org, which is an awesome site that we should all check out. He's currently the secretary at the 54th Assembly District for the GOP Central Committee. And he is a recurring guest on the Merle Eisner Show, where he talks about liberty. And tonight, he's going to tell us why the Liberty Kids are all right. So join me in welcoming Tyler Kotesky.
Hello, everyone. So I am here tonight to talk about millennials, which are the people. Basically, if you're the most generous definition of it is if you were born in 1980 or later. And for the purposes of our poll, we did 18 to 29, so varying estimates depending on what you believe. Well, so my boss, Emily, she very much, insists that it's up to 30, so that, she thinks that's a very important distinction there. But, so I'm happy that I was able to recover my ID, because I lost it a couple weeks ago, and nowadays, I just got a haircut today, and just shaved and everything. And if I had come later than I did, there's no way I would have been able to get in here without it. So I'm very happy to be at my first Liberty on the Rocks. And so I guess to talk about millennials, as Pablo said in the very generous introduction there, I'm an intern for the Reason Group Public Opinion Survey. And this summer, we just published a survey called Millennials, the Politically Unclaimed Generation. And what the gist of that was saying that, millennials, they have much higher rates of independency in their political affiliations than a lot of previous generations. when people have done polling on them before, they've tried to kind of paint them as these sort of progressive, socialist flower children. And really, that's pretty simplistic and is just not true when you look at sort of the different attitudes underlying things like their party registration and stuff. And what we've found at Reason is that there's kind of 4 key ingredients. One, that millennials are socially liberal, very much so, probably one of the most socially liberal generations, in history. 2, they're fiscally centrist, not fiscally really liberal as a lot of people would have you believe. And that the reasons for these, and because they're fiscal centrist, it shows that's exciting for libertarians because it shows that they can distinguish between these social and these economic issues, and so they're defying these kind of traditional political groupings or cleavages that we normally are used to in politics. And we think at Reason, just based on some of the polling that we did and other studies as well, that as they become older, make more money, buy houses, that kind of thing, we have reason to believe they're going to grow more fiscally conservative. And while we don't think their social policies will change, this might show that in a couple of years or a decade or so, you might have a really fiscally conservative and socially liberal generation going on at the same time. And that's just awesome and really optimistic for the future of liberty. So going into kind of looking at some of the polling behind this, when we see that they're socially liberal, looking at some of the overall demographics, millennials, they self-identify as liberal a lot more than older cohorts, and they identify a lot less as conservatives as well. About half as much millennials identify as conservative. At the same time, they're far more independent in their political labels as well. And despite this, their party registration is about the same percentage Democrat as the over 30 crowd. And if you think about this, it's interesting because really what the difference here in why the media is saying they're this super liberal, hippie, flower children generation is that they're just a lot less Republican and a lot more conservative. And when you think about this is for really good reason, because millennials are really socially liberal, and frankly, the Republican Party isn't. And they've done a really bad job at branding themselves and picking issues that are going to appeal, to be honest, to the future of the American electorate. When you look at millennials' positions on these social issues, they're really not in favor of a lot of the same kind of nanny state stuff that you might associate with Michael Bloomberg type liberals or Rick Santorum type conservatives. When you look at all kinds of things like Bitcoin, for instance, millennials are the only age group that are basically somewhat okay with Bitcoin. It's about 49 to 47% keep it legal or ban it, which might not sound that optimistic to us, but if you look at the rest of the age groups, it's a lot worse. And so I think millennials, they just seem to be generally okay with new things that they might not understand and have a more libertarian outlook on, hey, why do we need to ban something just because it's new and interesting? It's the same with pot legalization. Nearly 60% of millennials support legalizing marijuana compared to only 40% that oppose this. And 40% might seem high, but again, if you compare that to the rest of the electorate, it's a lot more optimistic and moving in the right direction. And you see similar trends where it's healthy majorities in support of legalizing things or keeping things legal, like online gambling, smoking e-cigarettes in public places, being able to watch pornography, keeping traditional incandescent light bulbs on the market, wearing Google Glass in public. All these things where, we talk about it and like, why the hell should something like that be banned? But invariably, some busybody nanny state politician somewhere has tried to ban it. And luckily with millennials, most of them are pretty permissive on that stuff and don't just want to, knee-jerk get rid of it. When we talk about these social issues too, it's interesting because unlike with kind of the economic issues that can change more over time as various as your interests change, depending on how much money you're making, things like that. We have evidence from Pew and some other places that you wouldn't really expect a lot of these social issues to change as much over time. If anything, people tend to become more socially liberal as they get older from being socially conservative, and not the other way around. Maybe unless you're Rick Santorum, who is former frat bro. But basically, when we look at social issues for millennials, we ask them how they perceive themselves, both on social and economic issues, and how they perceive people like Obama and Chris Christie. And compared to the median point, millennials perceive themselves as very left on social issues, and also as Obama being very left, and they consider themselves very close to him. Whereas Chris Christie, who, despite all the bones we might have to pick with him, he's no Rick Santorum or Michelle Bachmann. He's a little bit more moderate on some of the social issues. Millennials perceived him to be far more right than their ideal point was. But at the same time, now going into these fiscal issues, you saw that millennials considered themselves to be pretty middle of the road and perceived Obama as about as far left of them on economics that they perceive Chris Christie as right of them on social issues. So people are going around claiming that millennials are these entitled narcissistic brats that want the government to give them all this free stuff, and it's just not really true. At the end of the day, they perceive the Democratic Party and a lot of their leaders like Obama as oftentimes being far left of what they actually prefer for their policies. But it really comes down to the Republicans being just so much worse in their eyes that they're going to be much more likely to vote for the Democrats and register Democrat as a result. And so I think that's why, as quote-unquote liberty kids, we have a really good opportunity there. Part of what underlies why millennials aren't as accepting of these liberal economic positions as they are of the liberal social positions is some of their underlying values. On the survey, we asked them about things like what they thought about capitalism, profit, competition. And for all of these things, millennials were definitely majority in favor of companies making profits, competition being a positive force, and encouraging increases in quality as opposed to being this negative, divisive thing. And if they were truly, I guess, true blue Harvard liberals or something, they would think that, profit was inherently evil, competition is horrific, and that's just not the case. There are a lot of millennials, over, I think 55% of them, want to actually start their own business one day, which I thought was very cool. You can't, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you can't just automatically be this total socialist. Clearly your priorities are in a different place. And a lot of what I think this comes down to on why millennials will just often assume themselves to be liberal is because they don't necessarily know, unfortunately, what terms like big government and socialism mean. The reason we know this is because in the Reason Root survey on millennials, we asked them to define things like socialism, and we've seen also from other surveys that it's, I think, about a third or so can actually correctly define what socialism is, which is obviously the government managing the economy and controlling the means of production. And maybe to millennials, where they've grown up in a post-Cold War environment where a lot of the political rhetoric of maybe the McCarthy era and things like that, where we warn about the dangers of big government, if millennials, it's not as salient to them. A lot of millennials too are the sons and daughters of immigrants, so they haven't necessarily lived in the country as long to kind of have these different political terms that maybe other people are more familiar with embedded in their political lexicon. So appealing to the immorality of big government or socialism just doesn't appeal to millennials as much as the concrete trade-offs. Now, and that's something that we uncovered through the poll by asking questions that made these trade-offs more or less implicit. So for instance, some of the most interesting questions are when we ask them, do you favor a large government providing more services or a smaller government providing fewer services? Now, when we asked the question about when we asked that question, it was 54% in favor of big government and 43% in favor of the smaller government, which, you ask some commentator on MSNBC, and they're of course going to say, oh my God, this is great. They're all, progressives and will vote for Hillary. But when we ask them, they're ready for Hillary, yes. But when you ask them, do you favor a larger government providing more services with high taxes, which is what a larger government providing more services entails, or a smaller government providing fewer services with low taxes, the support completely flipped. It was 41% favored the large government and 57% favored the smaller government. So it was exactly the opposite, and it was a really cool dynamic. You had similar effects going on when we asked them about socialism versus capitalism. Millennials are still in favor of capitalism, but less so than some of the older cohorts. And I think what that has to do is just with some of the rhetorical values associated with capitalism that for this generation is less positive for various reasons. But when we ask them, do you favor a free market versus a government-managed economy, which is the exact same question, just using different descriptions and being a little bit more clear about what exactly both of those things entailed, millennials were far more in support of the free market. And then the same thing happened when we asked about healthcare too. We said, would you rather pay more in taxes to ensure that the uninsured, that I guess everyone has access to healthcare? And we split the results between millennials whose parents paid for their health insurance currently and millennials who pay their own health insurance. And again, it was one of these complete flips where if they actually incurred the real cost themselves, they were a lot less enthusiastic about paying more for other people. So I think what that shows is as millennials learn more about what the actual trade-offs implicit in these expansive government policies are, they're not going to be nearly as supportive of them. And so I think when we're messaging to younger people, that's something that we can really keep track of. And I know in the libertarian movement there's kind of a debate over, hey, are we supposed to have like a deontological approach and say big government is immoral, the state is immoral? And while I think that's fine, I think we also have to come at it from a utilitarian standpoint too and say big government is not only immoral, but it's also bad policy for these reasons. And so for people who don't necessarily align with all that Cold War rhetoric, this I think can help sway the narrative over time. And when I was talking about how millennials get more fiscally conservative over time, some of the evidence for that, we looked at millennials in college versus out of college, millennials who have jobs, etc. And unsurprisingly, the longer you are in college as a millennial, it's correlated with increased Democratic Party registration and decreased Republican and Independent registration because you're being constantly, indoctrinated while you're there. I go to UCLA, I'm no stranger to this. But when you get out of school and you make more money, when you get a job in general, if you get married, if you buy a house, this is all correlated with the opposite effect going on. And this is for various questions like support for an increased welfare state, support for income redistribution, a lot of various measures just about the size of government. So what I think there's hope for is that as these economic trade-offs that we asked about in these trade-off questions become more salient to millennials' daily lives, so for instance, if you have a mortgage payment to pay, and economics are clearly more important to you when you have a job that you're getting a huge percentage taken out of to go to the government, then you're going to care a little bit more about what the economic policies are. Because right now, most millennials determine their political labels primarily on social issues. That's another kind of question we fleshed out. Economics are a thing for millennials, but primarily most of them are deciding I'm liberal or I'm conservative, I'm progressive, I'm libertarian, based on social issues. So we had a lot of interesting open-ended responses during our survey, and we asked people, why do you identify as X political label? And about only a third of liberals who we surveyed said, I'm a liberal because, and then explained economic and social issues as a reason for that, which is what you typically think of with, Elizabeth Warren, Rachel Maddow. It's both the economics and the social issues. Another third explained their liberalism completely in terms of social issues. So whether that's, LGBTQ rights, just being generally open to people from other countries, thinking diversity is generally a good thing as opposed to a bad thing. So there is this huge swath of people that identified as liberal or democratic, and really not necessarily for the party line reasons. And there is a great quote. We also had another third, the last remaining third, were really just basing their liberalism on opposition to Republicans and conservatives more than anything else. So we completely have the message to reach out to a lot of these people who may not realize that they're libertarians and may find the label libertarian kind of strange and just associate it with, Ron Swanson or militia members or something like that. And I think if we can do a good job of showing why the social liberalism coupled with the fiscal conservatism is the best policy, that's where we got to go. So one of my favorite quotes from the open-ended responses was from a liberal, and it said, while I find myself disagreeing with most Democrats I know, I find myself further disagreeing with conservative policies, particularly social policies. So again, there you go. It's when the social issues are the most salient for this younger crowd, the GOP in particular is really alienating them by basically, having 20th century stances when we're in 2014 now. So again, I think that a lot of the practical applications we see from these is that, number one, if you're involved, like I am with ARPLAC and trying to get the GOP platform more pro-liberty, the GOP needs to stop pretending they're Jerry Falwell or Michelle Bachmann and going on these moral crusades. That's the best way for them to die within 20 years out there. At the same time, I think that as people in the liberty movement, regardless of what capacity we're trying to get people engaged, whether it's for a nonprofit cause like Restore the Fourth or Republican Liberty Caucus, anything, we got to focus on these concrete trade-offs and emphasize sort of our differences of how both economic conservatism and social liberalism can be good things. So again, just to kind of sum up before I go into any questions you guys have, just to review, what we found, millennials are very socially liberal, fiscally a lot more centrist than you'd think, and the fact that they are fiscally centrist and not fiscally liberal shows that they distinguish between these issues, and that's the key thing. And we have reason to believe that as they get older, they're going to become more fiscally conservative as the economic trade-offs inherent in government policies become more salient to them. And so it's a really exciting time to be alive and be active in the liberty movement because we are in a unique opportunity to engage and exploit this sort of disconnect that millennials have with the political process in general and show them why liberty is the way forward. So indeed, the kids are all right at the end of the day. Thank you very much. So I'll be happy to take any questions that you guys have. Jael? Yeah, how is it gonna?
First shout.
There's a line actually.
Did you wanna, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
It's okay.
So, with regards to, you're talking about the millennials and how they, this is so loud, perceive themselves as liberal. Is it possible, is it because they operate in an economy that is mostly unregulated for example, a lot of Obama's biggest backers are like Facebook billionaires,
Sure.
for example, yet they operate in a completely unregulated economy. Is that a factor? Is this something that you've looked into? I mean, if I buy most of my stuff online, or I make my money doing web design or social media, these are occupations are completely unregulated. Can you just expand on that?
Sure. I think that's a really good question because I think that might get to the meat of part of the reason why these trade-offs of why government policies hurt the economy so much may not be as clear to millennials. They see, as Jael was saying, they might use Facebook a lot and other avenues that the government has not sort of stuck its sticky hands in trying to regulate as much. I think one of the areas, especially for young people, that we can really get more engaged in and showing them, look, this is how the government is making your life worse, is ride-sharing services like Uber, Lyft, Sidecar. There's a assembly bill in Sacramento right now, actually, to force ride-sharing companies to provide like $1 million per driver in, I guess, accident insurance, which would really increase the barriers to entry for any new companies that wanted to start up. And so there's been a lot of backlash about that. And there's another assembly bill too, which is, again, towards these ride-sharing companies that has a lot of regulations, makes it more expensive and harder to reach. And so I think for things like that, it's just a matter of finding issues that are salient to millennials now, even if they don't have the six-figure jobs just yet. Did you wanna?
I've heard that millennials are losing trust in government. There was some poll out they lost a lot of trust in the institutions of the presidency and even Congress and partially the Supreme Court. So do you have any information on millennials and how they feel connected to their local governments versus their federal governments, or how they relate to different levels of government?
Sure. Also a good question. I know that Hughes corroborated this as well, but millennials in general, compared to a lot of other organizations, are, as Nick said, a lot less trustful of government in general. And this is why I think partly when we were looking at our data, why so many of them are much more likely to identify as independent or moderate. This is something that I forgot to mention, which I'm glad you brought up though, is that about 60% of millennials now view the government as just generally wasteful and inefficient. And I think about 56% in our survey agreed that regulators, when they're deciding regulations, generally favor special interests as opposed to the public interest. So this is awesome. It's like they're understanding regulatory capture and crony capitalism, and this is becoming more clear to them. And I think that's really exciting. People earlier were, again, claiming that they're this super progressive generation because in 2009 or something, Pew asked the exact same question, and only 44% of them thought that the government was generally inefficient. But again, this is 2009, it's the height of Obama mania, it's the stimulus package, he just rolled into office. And the fact that there's, a 16-point percentage differential in, just these past couple of years, I think shows as these big government economic policies become more clear and are affecting people's lives, millennials are starting to realize these trade-offs as more of them go out of college and everything and realize, oh, the economy really sucks right now. Maybe this has to do with some of the policies that we've had, which have lengthened our process of being able to recover. So.
Okay, there are no more questions. They're going to kick us out in just a couple minutes. So
Okay.
everybody, thank you, Tyler. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Very interesting. And guys, so we are going to be kicked out of this room in a minute or so for the band to set up. But feel free to mingle. We always do, usually in the outdoor patio.